Well, we talked about um, the making of of homemaking, of domesticity, as a display of the image of God. But I want to talk about the table now and how the table is something that also puts on display the good news of the gospel, and why it is that the table is so formative, raising kids and the formative, in the family, because of the central place that God uh, tells us food has in being people made in the image of God, or being creatures made in the image of God. So, um, as we continue on through this podcast on the mission of God for the family, we're in right now, we're talking about the domain of the garden in the three spheres that God sets up in Eden: the garden, the land, and the wilds. And in the garden, or in the home, in the place where Adam and Eve would have lived, where they go out to the land to work and then come back to the garden, or at least Adam would have gone out and come back. There's also plenty of work to do in the garden. But one of the things that God tells them right away is that this garden is here because it provides food. Um, and they were born hungry, and they were going to fill up the whole world with food. Even though there were two trees in the center of the garden that were made of food, technically, they were uh, but one they couldn't eat, and one they were supposed to avoid, and one that they were allowed to eat. Well, what happens is, when the serpent comes and they listen to the serpent and they eat the fruit, they're kicked out of the garden, and God puts cherubim with flaming swords to guard the garden. And uh, and God says it's so that they won't eat of the tree of life, right? And so this prohibition, or this distance from food, or from the food that brings life, becomes really a central theme throughout the Bible, um, because Adam and Eve are no longer able to go into the garden, into the sanctuary. That sanctuary food is off limits to them. um, but God says He is going to restore that fellowship. And you know the we there's quite a bit in Genesis about this, but we're going to kind of skip along the surface. When God's people end up slaves down in Egypt, He goes and He gets them. God sends Moses to get them with a pretty specific land, right? I'm going to take them to a good land, a land flowing with milk and honey. And then He goes and He says, I would like to take my people out into the wilderness to celebrate with them, to feast with them. Right? And so God is always calling His people, pulling His people back to the feast, and that He's going to establish them in a land that makes it possible for them to feast, in fact, to feast with Him. And even in the wilderness, if you're with God, the wilderness ends up being turned into a feast. I think Psalm 78 is one of those amazing passages that uh, we that sort of doesn't get its due, unfortunately. Um, because but the question in Psalm 19 that that God's enemies ask is, can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Right? Can God furnish a table in the wilderness? Is God really going to be able to set up a feast in the wilderness? And obviously, he brings water from the rock. He gives bread. Um, he sends the birds to His people. Um, and but uh, the God's people, though, they didn't, that was the question that they kept asking. But it was the question that was the question that God's enemies ask when they spoke against God. And so they're echoing God's people when they doubt Him, that they're echoing the doubts of God, or the accusations of God's enemies. Um, and it says, in verse 23, though He commanded the clouds from above and opened the doors of heaven, though He rained down manna upon them to eat, and gave them the corn, or the wheat of heaven, Man did eat angels' food, and he sent them meat to the full, or food to the full, right? Well, um, so out in the wilderness, God does furnish a table. Um, but it's a table that then eventually God moves, I mean, literally moves that into the Holy of Holies. There is manna in the Holy of Holies because that table is his presence. It's his direct presence. And so they have it out in the wilderness. Um, and then God moves them into the land of Canaan, and he sets up a series of feasts with them. He sets up a consistent eating pattern. And in Deuteronomy 14, he says one of the things they're supposed to use their tithe for is to consistently celebrate and eat with the Lord, eat with one another in the Lord's presence. Right? God is constantly restoring his people to a table. Right, he's bringing them back into his presence so that they can eat with him, because food is the way that we is one of the props that God gave us in the theater of this story of fellowship, right? He says this is how we're going to come together, right? God says, I'm going to give myself to you, and then he gives himself to us in these different meals. I remember when my dad died, all of the neighbors that loved him and cared for him and cared for us, they wanted to be with us, but they know they couldn't be with us constantly, and so they would bring us food, saying, here is my presence to be with you. Here's brownies. We love you, right? That's the way that we give ourselves to people. And the problem is that we have that there are now these cherubim in the way of the direct presence of God, of the table of God, right? Throughout the tabernacle and the temple, the the um the manna is behind the cherubim. Um, so you've got bread in the sanctuary, but you've also got the manna there, and we couldn't get back to God's table. Um, so and this is a theme all throughout the Bible, is that there's this distance between us and God, and so we can't be restored to the feast. But Isaiah predicts that that's what's coming when the Messiah comes. In this mountain shall the Lord of hosts make unto all people a feast of fat things, a feast of wines on the lees, of fat things full of marrow, of wines on the lees well refined. Right? He says the Messiah is going to come, and all of the nations of the earth are going to be invited to the feast. I mean, that's one of the main descriptions in Isaiah 55 of what's coming when the Messiah comes, is he who thirsts, come to the waters. Even if you have no money, you're going to come and buy and eat wine and milk and money, and without money, without price. Um, and your soul is going to fill itself with fatness at this table in the future. So when Jesus comes, he's coming to solve one of the central problems of humanity, that we're created to eat with God, but because of our sin, we couldn't come to the feast. And so Jesus comes eating and drinking and feeding, and uh, he gives bread and wine. He says he is our food, right? He is the manna in the wilderness. That's what it was all about the whole time. Um, and in fact, when he goes up on the cross, one of the things that happens is the the veil is torn, and that veil has cherubim sewn on it, right? So that's torn down, so that we actually have access again directly to the table of the Lord, to God's presence, right? We can come right in to God's presence, and he says. Uh, Jesus says, many will come from east and west and shall sit down with Abraham and Isaac and Jacob in the kingdom of heaven. Right. Um, he says, I appoint unto you a kingdom, as my Father has appointed unto me, that you will eat and drink at my table in the kingdom, and sit on thrones judging the 12 tribes of Israel. Right? The kingdom of heaven is a feast. So when we are uh, creating a home, one of the things that's at the heart of the home is the table, right? Is the feast, is the food, is dinner, is breakfast, is lunch, right? And it's easy to fall into the trap that what's going on there is it's a refueling station, right? That we think of food in terms of calorie count. We think of food in terms of just getting the right vitamins and minerals and all that, right? That's the whole point of food, is to refuel the machine of our bodies. But really, the point is the fellowship. Now, learning to eat well and use food properly and use it, you take dominion over it, all of that is good. But even when you think about, when we talk about taking dominion over food, we almost always mean in terms of health. Like our body is a mechanism that we need to keep functioning well, and so food is the input for health. But we see that Isaiah tells us that a good meal together with God's people feeds souls, right? So um, the the time that we spend eating together, the time that we spend together, that isn't just simply refueling. Now, this is something that the Charles Finney in the Second Great Awakening. Um, he was he was a secret heretic. It came out later that he was a heretic because he didn't publish his heretical writings, but he wasn't. He didn't um, hold uh, to a true doctrine internally, but he was a famous preacher at the time. But you see the difference between the First Great Awakening and the Second Great Awakening, in the difference between guys like Jonathan Edwards and guys like Charles Finney. One of the things, but what had happened was the shift in cosmology from a biblical understanding of the world, to a mechanistic understanding of the world had happened. And you see with Charles Finney that he has a mechanistic understanding of things. When in his autobiography, he talks about things like food, when he says, unless you're eating to refuel for the purpose of evangelism, you're sinning, right? He says, our main goal is evangelism, and food is fuel that I use to go out and evangelize, right? Well, that's just not a biblical view of food. And so the art of food is to create is to create something that is a gift that blesses people, and that sits between people and becomes a means of fellowship, right? And that's what the table does in the home, and it's one of the things that's really formative in it's one of the ways we landscape the imagination of our children towards uh, towards God, towards good things, towards an understanding of the way the world really is, because we put on display the gospel when we are building a place for fellowship to happen at the table, right? We're putting on display the future that God has said our children have, which is the marriage supper of the Lamb, right? The meal is an eschatological moment where the future is brought into the present, and it is a place where the good news of fellowship with God is put into practice when we have a table that has fellowship with one another. So one of the things that the good news does is restore food to its proper place, and one of the things that the mission, one part of the mission of the family, is to put on display the good news of the coming perfect fellowship with God at the marriage supper of the Lamb at the end of time, in the home, using the table and the food that we eat together.